Welcome back tonight. We're gonna sing one song before, and we can't have 4th of July without singing 635, the Star Spangled Banner. And even though it doesn't look like it, I do put a little effort into this. I know Greg puts in more than I do. Go back and research the Star Spangled Banner. I'm not going to go into history because we have a historian going to come up in just a minute. But there's actually more than just one verse to the Star Spangled Banner, and our hymnal has two. Actually, it's 1 and 4. And that was written in during the War of 1812. And we don't sing verse 2 enough, and we're going to sing it tonight. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. And, we don't sing that one enough. We really don't. So let's all stand, and let's turn to number 635, and we're going to sing both verses. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Oh, thus be it ere when free men shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto: in God is our trust. And the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Mr. Dugan, would you open us?
Amen. Well, tonight we're going to do something a little different because it's 4th of July weekend, and we can do that. So I'm going to ask you to turn, instead of to Genesis, to Psalm 78. Psalm 78. And while you're doing that, I'm going to give you a quiz since we're talking about history. And by the way, Francis Scott Key and his story really is a fascinating story. He was a very devoted Christian. It is an interesting historical study. But I'm going to give you a little quiz here and see how you do. All right, the 4th of July became a federal holiday in what year? 1776? Let's see if I can make this work. 1784, 1845, or 1941? What do you think? Anybody want to guess? Travis wants to guess. He's got his hand up. Okay, Travis says C, 1845. Anybody else got a different guess? I know who knows his history. 1941. Yeah, oh, I'm sorry. I misheard you, Travis. I'm sorry. All right. Along with July 4th, there are 3 other national holidays that aren't held on Monday. Everything else is on Monday. Of course, we know what they are. It's Christmas, New Year's, and Veterans Day. Thanksgiving is not a federal holiday. All right, when did many of the delegates actually sign the Declaration? Was it on July 4th, August 2nd, or July 2nd of 1776? July 4th? Right, they actually voted on July the 2nd for independence, but they actually voted on the wording of the Declaration itself on the 4th, and some of them, and there's debate now as to when they actually signed it. They think most of them actually signed it on July 4th, but some were not present and signed it on, oops, let me back up. Oh, well, I didn't, anyway, on August the 2nd of 76. So really that's a trick question. It could be July the 4th, but some actually signed it on August the 2nd of 76. All right. All right, was the Liberty Bell rung on July 4th of 1776? Yes or no? I hear a lot of no's. You're right. It was not rung on July 4th, 1776. In fact, they're not sure now whether it was rung at all that year because the steeple in Independence Hall was weak and they weren't ringing the bell. But it is possible that on the 8th of July, when it was actually, they called the people together to read the Declaration of Independence publicly, that the bells of Philadelphia did ring, so it may have rang on the 8th. But on July 4th, there was no bell ringing. Another kind of trick question. All right, who was the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence? I'll give you multiple choice. Roger Sherman, Charles Carroll, or Benjamin Franklin? Very good. Brother Bob knew that one. Charles Carroll. Do you know how old he was when he died? Did you really? Wow. Charles Carroll was 95 years old when he died. He outlived the first 4 presidents of the United States. He was, at the time the revolution began, the wealthiest man in the colonies. They said he was worth over what today would be about $270 million. Charles, by the way, Carroll County in Carrollton, Missouri, named after Charles Carroll. There's a Carroll County in Carrollton, Kentucky. There's a Carroll County, Mississippi. There's Carroll things all over the place, and certainly in Baltimore. He was from Maryland, and so he was a lot of things in Maryland. In fact, their state song talks about Carroll and all that he did. By the way, the other interesting fact about Charles Carroll was he was the only Roman Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence. All right, which colony had the most signers of the Declaration? Was it Pennsylvania, New York, or Georgia? I'm hearing a bunch of different. I bet Brother Ken. Do you know Brother Ken? New York. That's a good guess. Anybody else got a guess? All right, the convention was held in Philadelphia, so it's a little easier for the folks from Pennsylvania to get there. There was 9 signers from Pennsylvania. Virginia was next. I think they had 7. Most of the rest had 3 or 4, but New York had 5, so they were third. Brother Ken, they were third highest of the 13. All right, who was the youngest signer of the Declaration? Was it John Adams, Button Gwinnett, or Edward Rutledge? I bet some of these names you've never heard of, right? It was Edward Rutledge. Anybody want to guess how old he was? No. He was 26 years old. He was a 26-year-old lawyer. All right, who introduced the resolution proposing independence that led to the Declaration? Was it Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Jefferson, or Richard Stockton? It was Richard Henry Lee, and just since I talked about Robert E. Lee this morning, that was his grandfather's first cousin that actually said, hey, let's move towards independence, and they set up the men to write the Declaration. All right. Which of these Declaration signers were captured during the War of Independence? Was it William Ellery, George Read, or George Walton? You're saying, I don't know any of those from me. Okay. It was George Walton. He was one of 5 that were captured by the British. They were all fighting in the colonial army. Walton was injured and captured at the Battle of Savannah. All right, which of these Declaration signers was a minister? Samuel Adams, John Witherspoon, or James Wilson? That's exactly right, Brother Ken. It was John Witherspoon, who's a Presbyterian minister. All right. Which Declaration signer helped found the first Bible Society in America? Was it Benjamin Rush, Stephen Hopkins, or Arthur Middleton? If y'all aren't familiar with this fella, Benjamin Rush was one of the most, an amazing Christian founding father. I mean, if you want to look at somebody who was absolutely adamant about their faith, Benjamin Rush was. In fact, he was the one who started the public school system in America, and guess which book he thought should be the primary book for education? The Bible. That's exactly right. Who are the 3 men tasked with writing the Declaration of Independence? I bet y'all can get these. I'm not going to give you multiple choice on this. I'm just going to list them when you figure them out. All right, who wrote the Declaration of Independence? We know who ended up. Okay, Jefferson is the one who ended up, but there are actually 3 men who were tasked with a committee to do it, but Jefferson did pretty much write it. It was Thomas Jefferson. Okay, we think Franklin and Madison. Any other guesses? Adams. Very good. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. Very good. All right, and speaking of, and we'll kind of finish with this story. Speaking of Jefferson and Adams, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams really didn't know each other. Before, Adams was from up north, Jefferson was from Virginia. But they met as part of the Continental Congresses and whatnot, and became very, very close friends. They were tasked to write the Declaration together and went through the conventions together. But they kind of had 2 different views. Adams believed they needed a strong central government to ensure the success of the new nation, so he was a federalist. Jefferson was very concerned about a centralized power. He was more interested in states' rights, so he was a Republican. And they had a little different views. But in 1789, now back then, you remember when you run for president, you didn't run as a party ticket, president and vice president. Just whoever got the most votes became president. Whoever got the second most votes became vice president. And so when Washington ran, John Adams came in second, so Adams became the vice president, served twice. Well, after Washington said, I'm not running again, 8 years is enough, time for someone else, Adams and Jefferson ran against each other. And you know how political campaigns can get kind of dirty and back and forth, and they had little different views of which direction the country should go, strong federal government or states' rights. So the election was held, and of course Adams won, and Jefferson came in second, became the vice president. But again, they're from 2 different political parties, had 2 really kind of different directions they wanted to take things. So John Adams didn't use Thomas Jefferson much. He just kind of pushed him to the side for 4 years. Jefferson basically went home in a huff, and the 2 just didn't get along. So the next election, Jefferson and Adams ran against each other again. But in the next election, both Aaron Burr and Jefferson beat out John Adams. And the 1800 election, some of the supporters of Jefferson hired this guy to write horrible things about John Adams, and just a lot of ugly, dirty things going on. In fact, that fellow ended up going to jail for slander. But when it was over, John Adams, because he wasn't the president or vice president, he didn't even go to the inauguration. He got in his carriage and went home and didn't even go attend the ceremony. And the 2 of them became just bitter enemies. They wouldn't talk to each other. They've been so close, and now they would have nothing to do with each other for years. And it was, by the way, it was Benjamin Rush. You remember I said the fellow Benjamin Rush was the one who wanted these 2 men to make amends. And so years later, he goes to both of them he goes to Jefferson and says, hey, Adams wants to make amends with you. Why don't you write to each other? And he'd go to Adams and say, hey, Jefferson, I hear he wants to make amends with you. Y'all talk to each other. And in fact, he told them he had a dream. Now, whether he really did have the dream or not, but he claimed to have had a dream where he saw that they had renewed their correspondence with one another. And part of their thinking was they wanted to to preserve what actually happened in those early days of confusion as the Declaration and the Constitutional Conventions, all those things were happening. These were two of the men who were in the middle of it. A lot of things were being written and said about it. You know how people's recollections change through the years. And so they said, we want to set records straight and do the best we can to tell people what actually happened. And so they did begin corresponding with one another. And Benjamin Rush's dream, he said, I see that you guys are going to renew your friendship, and that both of you will pass away, melting away to the grave about the same time. And that did actually happen. They did renew their friendship, and they wrote back and forth and became very cordial again, writing to the end of their death, or to their death. And everybody knows when they both died. Do you remember when they died? That's right, they died on the same day, July the 4th, 1826. Now, part of the reason I did all that, it's just kind of fun to quiz our memories about what we know or don't know, but one of the things that's important, I think, for us, especially in the world we live in, for Christians, we ought to remember our history. Good, bad, or otherwise, was John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. In fact, because of the things that had gone on in the 1800 election, because of the slander that this newspaper man had put against John Adams on behalf of Jefferson supporters, he expected, once he got out of jail, to receive a post from Jefferson, who was now president. He wanted to be given a government post. When Jefferson didn't, he began to publish articles in the newspaper exposing his, slave paramour, that Sally Hemings, that people have blasted Jefferson about from then on. The point being, was Jefferson a perfect man? No. John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, both very devout Christians. Were they perfect men? No. Benjamin Rush, who was a very, very devout Christian, was he perfect? No. Can you point to things that are good and bad in any person? Sure you can. But we ought to remember our history and the way God has worked in history. And that's why I point you to Psalm 78. And it's a long psalm, so we're not going to go through all of it. I'm just going to hit kind of some highlights as we go through. But one of the things that we ought to do, and Psalm 78 teaches us, is we ought to review our history and to know the way God has worked through our history. Psalm 78:1 says, Meshul of Asaph. He says, Give ear, O my people, to my law, incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable, I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. Our fathers have taught us these things, passed them down. Verse 4, we will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he has done. For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel. Now watch, which he commanded our fathers that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. He said, listen, Israel, make sure your children know their history and the way I have worked in your history, the way I've blessed, the way I've worked. Look back and see it. There are, certainly our founding fathers saw many parallels, but certainly we can look back. We are not Israel, it's the United States of America, but we had folks who sought to make God our leader, ultimate leader. And we were one nation under God. And God blessed that. And I think we ought to remember that. It's kind of like the little boy who came home from school and he told his dad, he said, I'm afraid I failed my history test. His father said, oh, just wait till you get your grade back. Just think positive. He said, all right, I'm positive. I failed my history test. I know. Look, we need to make sure our children know our history, because what's happening is, as they're tearing down all the, it started off they wanted to tear down Confederate monuments, and everybody knew that was not the end of it. Now they're tearing down the monuments of our founding fathers. That's not the end of it either. They want to erase anything from our Judeo-Christian past and who we are and the working of God in history, because they want to remake us into something very different. And you have parents who say, well, I'm not going to force religion on my kids, and I'm going to let them make their own decision, make up their own mind. Can I tell you, if we don't teach our children and put something in their mind for them, the world's going to put something in their mind, right? And you know what the world's going to put in their mind? The world's going to put in their mind this idea that, you look at what's happening around us. Here's what, you wonder why younger folks are buying into what's happening with all this unrest in our country. It is not happening by accident. It is absolutely planned. And you can say I'm a conspiracy theorist or anything like that, but I'm telling you, just look at it. It is absolutely a Marxist plot. You can follow the history of it. That's why we ought to know our history. The Marxists, when the Soviet Union fell, Marxist who died back in the 1800s, he said, the world is made up of oppressors and oppressed. And so the only reason you have some people over another is because they're oppressing the people under them. And so if you're privileged, then you're obviously an oppressor. And if you're not privileged, then you're obviously oppressed. And so you're in one of these groups, and always the oppressed rise up against the oppressors and overthrow it. And there's this constant turmoil throughout history where the oppressed overthrow the oppressors, and you keep turning things over. And they couldn't understand why people didn't rise up and say, oh, we're being oppressed. Because they said capitalism oppresses the masses, how terrible it is. And they couldn't understand why that didn't happen. So there was a group of Marxists in Germany, in the Frankfurt School, who said, well, it's not just economic Marxism, it's cultural Marxism. It's a cultural thing. There's people in that culture who control not just the economics to oppress people, but they control the culture. They work through churches and schools and different, the culture of society to maintain control so that they can keep oppressing the oppressed. And so they group everybody into groups. People are not individuals anymore. You're a part of a group. You're a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male, or you're a black transgendered, handicapped woman, or everybody's in all these different categories. And if you're in certain categories, you're oppressed. In other categories, you're the oppressor, just depending on the category you're in. So no longer, let's say the police officers with Michael Brown and all of that, the police officer didn't have to do anything wrong to be guilty. He was automatically guilty because he was an oppressor simply because of who he was. He was white. But if you're in one of the oppressed groups, like if you're black, for instance, that's an oppressed position, they say. And so they say if you're in that group, well, then you can do no wrong, because even if you do something wrong, you've only done it because it's a result of your victimization, that you have been oppressed, and that's why you've done it. So therefore, it's excusable. So one group can do no right, the other group can do no wrong. And then they've added in intersectionality to say, well, you can add things. So you might have a circle here where you're black. And then over here you say you're a woman, which again, I don't know why women are considered a minority. They make up more than half the population. But anyway, you have men, you say you're black, you're a woman, you're transgendered, and here in the middle these circles are overlapping. And if you're a black woman, transgendered, homosexual, who happens to be handicapped, and you just keep adding in all these things, and the more intersectional victimizations that you have, the more you're considered oppressed, and therefore you are to rise up against the oppressor. So it doesn't matter whether the person has actually done anything. So if you happen to be a white Protestant male, why because they classify you in the privilege, that doesn't mean you are privileged, but they classify you as that. So therefore you're automatically guilty whether you do anything or not, simply because of the group that you're in. No wonder they're lighting the cities on fire and carrying on about all this, because they just assume that's what the world is teaching, and they've been teaching it in our schools for 20 years. When this first came up in the Southern Baptist Convention 2 years ago, I didn't have a clue what critical race theory and intersectionality was when they foisted it upon our convention, and we voted for it. I didn't vote for it, but I'm telling you, people voted for it thinking they were voting against racism. It has nothing to do with racism. It has everything to do with Marxism, trying to build in the hearts of our children that they are either oppressed or an oppressor in whatever group they're in. So if you're white, you have white privilege, and you need to get down on your face and beg forgiveness for the racism that's in your heart, whether you've got it or not. That's what's happening in our country. That's why we need to get back and say, wait a minute. Let's teach our children the truth. Let's go back and review what God has done in history. Because what God says is that every person is made in the image of God, and we are equal one with another. And these people who say that the United States of America and capitalism is all about oppressing people, excuse me, just look at the history. It is not about oppressing people. Capitalism is the one form of government, because it was designed and created by folks who believed in Christian principles and followed them. It is designed to treat everyone as equal and give everyone an equal opportunity. No more is there a divine right of kings that people thought, well, God endowed certain people in a better place, and they have certain privileges given by God and others don't. No more did we say that. We said, oh no, all are created equal in the image of God. Think about this. Thomas Edison was a poor boy, and he grew up. There's still 1,150 patents that are in his name. Look at what he did. Rockefeller, did he grow up privileged? He grew up very poor, but he made a fortune. Henry Ford was a poor mechanic. Look what Henry Ford did. Have you ever been to the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln? It's a log cabin, right? And yet look where he came. You don't have to agree with all these different people, but, did Bill Clinton grow up in privilege? He grew up in a trailer house with a single mom in Arkansas. He wasn't privileged. He became the president of the United States. Was Barack Obama privileged? Absolutely not. He wasn't privileged. He grew up that, his mom was anything but a righteous, wonderful mother. I'm just stating the fact there. I'm not picking. But he became the president of the United States. Are we really a country that anyone has the opportunity in America to succeed? And that's why we ought to tell people the truth and review our history so people know the truth. The system that has allowed these opportunities for people was, again, set up by Christians and founded on Christian principles. Now, there are folks who want to erase that, either want to erase our history or besmirch our founding fathers to pick out the sins in their life and their negativities and ignore the things they did right. Humanists want us basically to have a godless society. So if we want a godless society, we can't honor men who believed in creation. What does the Declaration of Independence say? We are endowed by who? Where do we get our rights from? By our Creator. That means they believed in creation. They didn't buy into, what would later become Charles Darwin's theories, and no, they believed in a creator God. Well, we can't honor folks like that. Why, those folks couldn't have come up with a good system of government. We can't honor anybody who believes in divine providence. How did they end the Declaration of Independence? They knew they couldn't. Do you realize that the King of England, at the time they declared independence, ruled over the largest empire that the world has ever known? The sun never set on the British Empire. And yet this group of upstart colonists who had no military, zero navy, they didn't have a John boat to row out in the bay, had nothing. And yet they're declaring their independence from England. So they ended their independence by saying, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. That's who we're relying on. With a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. It was a declaration of independence from England and a declaration of dependence upon God. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, a people whom he has chosen for his own inheritance, Psalm 33:12 says. There's no doubt how our nation was founded, why it was founded, and what it was founded upon. They're trying to tear down the statues of Christopher Columbus. Oh, he came to enslave the natives and do terrible things to them. They've written Christopher Columbus. You would think he was, the next thing from Adolf Hitler or Himmler and some of those guys. Actually, if you read his own diaries, one of the reasons he said, I'm coming that I want to reach India is I want to reach them with the gospel and the good news of Jesus Christ. He writes that in his journal. North America was, they discovered North America. The colonists began to come. Of course, it was predominantly North America settled by the English, except St. Augustine, which, by the way, was French Huguenots kicked out by the Catholics who wanted to get rid of Christians in France, or Bible-believing Christians, I should say. They came there, and then the Spaniards came and killed all the Huguenots and resettled St. Augustine. But other than that, the northern colonies were all settled by the English. And why did the Pilgrims come to? Yeah, they came for religious freedom. They had fled persecution, gone up to Holland. Then they were concerned about their children being influenced by the Dutch, who were not very moral people. And they said, our children are, they're seeing these young people over here, and they're falling in love and getting married with them, and their hearts are going away from God. And they said, we don't want that. They said, we'd rather go take our chances out in the wilderness and die in the wilderness, where we can teach our children to love God and at least be in heaven together, than to do this. And that's why they came to America. Before they landed, before they ever got off that ship, they got in the hold of that Mayflower, and they came up with the Mayflower Compact, where they said, here's how we're going to do this. And absolutely, they said, we are here to honor God. From that, all of our systems of government basically came down through that. Patrick Henry stood in the church at Richmond and concluded his very eloquent plea for independence. I know not what other direction others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, give me death, that speech. That same Patrick Henry wrote in his will, he said, I've now disposed of all my property to my family. There's one more thing that I wish I could give to them, and that's the Christian religion. If they had that and I had not given them 1 shilling, they would have been rich. And if they had not that and I had given them the world, they would be poor. George Washington, the father of our country, a man came home and said, I know we're going to win this war of independence. And they said, well, how are you so sure? He said, because I just passed George Washington out there in the woods on his knees in the snow praying. and you can't defeat that. Certainly there's truth to that. Only one of the 39 framers of the Constitution was not affiliated with a major Christian denomination. Only one. They chose to articulate the date of the document of the Constitution by saying this: done in convention by the unanimous consent of the states present in the 7th day of September in the year of our Lord. They were acknowledging God. Though the religious beliefs of the denominations may have been different, they were all very much Christian. They all believed in the triune God, and they all believed in the deity of Jesus Christ. They were Christians. I don't mean to demean anyone who's not a Christian, but all these people, there were no Muslims who established the greatest country in the history that the world has ever known. They weren't there signing the Declaration. They weren't there helping form the Constitution. There were no Buddhists. There were no Hindus. It was Christians who formed these documents on Christian beliefs. The documents which form the foundation of our society, designed by Christian men with Christian principles. George Washington said, "The propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregard the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained." James Madison, who of course the architect of our Constitution, fourth president, said, "We have staked the whole future of American civilization not upon the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves. Not big government, but that we as individuals govern ourselves to sustain ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God." That's the key. December 1820, Daniel Webster said, "Let us not forget the religious character of the origin of our fathers were brought hither by their veneration of the Christian religion. They journeyed by its light and labored in its hope. They sought to incorporate its principles and to diffuse its influence throughout all their institutions, civil, political, or literary." On July 4th, 1821, John Quincy Adams said, "The highest glory of this American Revolution was this: it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of the civil government with the principles, of Christianity." We sang our national anthem tonight, as Brother Ken pointed out. We sing, "Praise the power that hath made us and preserved us a nation, and conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, and God is our trust." We also have a national hymn. Anybody know what our national hymn is? We sang it this morning, "God of our fathers." One of those verses, "Our fathers God to thee, author of liberty, to thee we sing. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might." You remember the last line? "Great God, our King." America has a king? The United States of America has a king? Yes, we do. We do have a king. We have presidents that we can vote in and out of office, but we've got a king that can't be voted out of office. Our founding fathers acknowledged our king. Psalm 78:4 says, "We will not hide them." We won't hide our history from our children, showing the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he has done. We have failed to teach our children history, and instead, folks with a very opposing atheistic view have taught them lies. And we wonder why we're getting what we've got. Oh, how we need to review our history. We also need to renew our memory. Look at verse 7. Psalm 78:7 says that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God. The children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. They kept not the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law. And watch, they forgot his works and his wonders that he had shown them. The tribe of Ephraim at that time was the strongest of the tribes, one of the largest of the tribes. And here they were the best armed of the tribes. They've got the bows and arrows. This was in a day before the Israelites had metal armor. Bows and arrows, that was their supreme weapon in that day. And yet they turned back. Why? Because they forgot his works and his wonders. We need to renew our memory. I'll tell you, one of the things that messes us up, one of the reasons Ephraim messed up was they had succumbed to memory killers. You know what causes your memory and your mind to go bad? It's what Beth and I had a professor in seminary. You know what he used to say? He said, "Sin makes you stupid." It does, doesn't it? Sin makes you stupid. When you get to thinking about that, it does. It makes people do stupid things. But here's 3 things that will mess with your memory. The first is the lust of the flesh. Fast forward down to verse 17. It says, "They sinned yet more against him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness." Do y'all think that we're provoking God when we light up the White House and rainbow colors not to represent his promise, but rather to represent our shaking our fist in the face of God. We'll do it our way. You think we're shaking our fist in the face of God when we say we don't want your 10 Commandments, anywhere in public view? Are we shaking our fist in his face when we say we don't want God to be involved in our public life in America? We don't want to acknowledge you. We want your blessings, but we want you to stay in the background. Let us do whatever we want, even when we know it's wrong. And we're just doing this in his face. They sinned yet more against him, provoking the Most High in the wilderness. We are absolutely provoking God. I'm amazed at God's mercy, and I pray for his mercy to continue. Oh, how merciful he has been to us. Verse 18 says, "And they tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust. Yea, they spake against God. They said, Can God furnish a table in the wilderness? Behold, he smote the rock, and the waters gushed out, and the streams overflowed. Can he give bread also? Can he provide flesh for his people?" There's the lure of the flesh. We want meat to eat, and we want, it's the desires of the flesh. Not only the lust of the flesh, but also the lure of the world. Fast way forward down to verse 40. Verse 40 says, "How often did they provoke him in the wilderness and grieve him in the desert? Yea, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. They remembered not his hand nor the day when he delivered them from the enemy." They limited God. Isn't that interesting that we can limit God? We limit God when we don't trust him and when we do our own thing, and not only did they bind to the lust of the flesh and the lure of the world, but also the lies of the devil. Fast forward on down to verse 58. It says, "For they also provoked him to anger with their high places and moved him to jealousy with their graven images. They forgot the God, the true God, who founded them as a nation. Now they're worshiping false gods." All right, so we ought to renew our memory, review our history, renew our memory, and here's the last thing. We ought to reclaim our legacy. And by the way, that alliteration isn't mine. Adrian Rogers came up with that, and I liked it because I think it adequately shows exactly what this psalm is saying. But we ought to reclaim our legacy because it's true. And people can deny it. I don't think we have to whitewash all of the characters of our history and say they were perfect individuals. I think we ought to honor the things they did good and denounce the things they did wrong. I think just like in our own personal life, we ought to confess the things we did wrong and say, you know what, that was wrong. And we ought to strive to do the things that are good. But just be honest about it and put it out there, and we can see how God has worked. We ought to be teaching our history and reclaiming that legacy because our country is not headed in a godly direction at all. That is not the trajectory we're on. There's a story out of World War II, some French who had been captured. The Germans would put their prisoners in work camps and have them do all kinds of labor. Well, they had these French soldiers creating munitions. They were making bombs, and they knew these bombs were going to be dropped on French cities. And they thought, how can we build bombs that we know are going to be dropped upon our families and our fellow Frenchmen? And the Germans started finding that a lot of these bombs that were dropping, they would drop, but they wouldn't explode when they hit the ground. They were duds. Well, some of them were going to be duds, but they said, there shouldn't be this many duds. They said, something's going on here. And so when, of course, as Germany overran France, they found some of these unexploded shells, and they began to take them apart to say, why are our shells not exploding? What's wrong with these? And they found that they had been designed not to explode. And inside those shells, here's what these French soldiers had done. They had taken pieces of paper and they had written notes, and they had stuffed them inside those bombs, hoping that their fellow countrymen would find them. And in those notes, they wrote, "We are doing the best we can with what we've got, where we are, every chance we get." We're doing the best we can with what we've got, where we are, every chance we get. I think if Christians in America would do that, there's still a righteous remnant in America. There's folks who love the Lord Jesus Christ all over this country. And if we would all simply do the best we can with what we've got, where we're at, every chance we get, being faithful to God. Look, it doesn't take a mighty army. Look what God did with Gideon and 300 men. But look, God doesn't need many men. God doesn't need many people. What God needs are faithful people who will do what they can, where they are, with what they've got, every chance they get, to allow God to use them. And God can bring revival to our land. we need to be remembering our history. We need to be teaching it. And we need to be pointing people to remember the past so we can head forward in the future honoring God. Would you let me pray for us? Our Lord Jesus, I thank you for the great, incredible privilege and blessing that you have poured out upon us. You're a sovereign God, and you in your sovereignty allowed us in this room to be born in this country, and even as Brother Greg prayed tonight, even with all of our flaws, even with all of the things that we're doing that are just absolutely a disgrace towards you, and yet I'd still rather live here than anywhere else in the world, just by druthers. Father, we're so thankful to live in a nation where we do still have freedoms. We recognize that those freedoms come from you and that they are controlled by you, that you can remove your hand of blessing anytime you want and remove those freedoms from us. So I pray that you would help us, that we would be maybe even like Lot and his family could have been in Sodom, that you would have spared Sodom in all of its decrepitness, where every man in the city, from the oldest to the youngest, was trying to beat down the doors in absolute filth and evil, and yet you would have spared even them if there had just been a handful of folks who loved you and were faithful. I pray that you would help us to be those faithful folks, that even as the world around us, even if it does get darker and more difficult, even if it does become a place where we're the ones that are the oppressed, the genuinely oppressed, I pray that you would help us to continue to remain faithful, to remain true, and to be that salt and light in the world in which you've placed us, that indeed your mercy might be upon our nation for our sakes, and that we might be that genuine light and that genuine blessing to the people amongst whom you have allowed us to be born and placed us for such a time as this, in our time, to be faithful to you. Help us to be faithful. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, before we leave tonight, we're going to have our time of decision. There may be public decisions that need